Welcome to the Alain Guillot podcast, a podcast about life, leadership, and money matters. Our guest today is Azeem Azhar. Azeem is the creator of the Exponential View, one of the leading platforms for understanding the impact of technology on society. His weekly newsletter is read by over 200,000 people from around the world, while his podcast attracts guests such as Yuval Noah Harari, Tony Blair, and Reid Hoffman. And today we will speak about his book, The Exponential Age, how accelerating technology is transforming business, politics, and society. Asim, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Alan, what a pleasure to chat with you.
So, Asim, I'm so full of questions. I don't even know where to start, but let's start from the beginning. Can you tell us how do you ended up in England? I had to tell my listeners that most of my guests are in the United States. In Canada, you are from the other side of the ocean. So, yeah, tell us how you ended up there.
My story is not the most direct version of being in the UK. I was born in Zambia in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, there are lots of people who have migrated. So migrating is not a rarity in the modern world in the last 100 years at all. I guess what was curious about my story is that my parents had already migrated to the UK, and they migrated. My dad migrated to the UK when he was studying, and he naturalized as a British citizen from Pakistan in the late 50s. And then some 15 years later, after he had got married, he took a job with the British government and was posted abroad to Zambia, and that's where I was born. So when I was growing up in Zambia, I was part of an expat community, but back then in the 70s, I don't think we had a strong political awareness of this idea of migration, really, and certainly not, not to Africa from the UK. And we stayed for several years, and I then went back to the UK when I was 8 years old as a second generation immigrant who was a son, but was perhaps I was a first generation immigrant because it was never altogether clear. And I really didn't feel British until I was about 15 or 16. What I thought I was, who knew? Because I certainly wasn't, Zambian in any sort of deep cultural sense of the word.
Well, that's quite curious. And this is a testament that right from the time that you were born already, we were seeing migration from well, it's always been going on, but now later because of climate change and economic inequalities among countries, we are seeing this exodus from many countries and into European countries, into the United States, Canada, and I guess your family and my family as well represents this kind of migrations we are seeing nowadays.
Yeah, I mean, migration is, has been as old as the hills in a way, and quite often has been driven by, economic circumstance or war and so on. I mean, I think we should recognize also that in all the drivers of migration, you see technology playing a part, whether it is the steamship or the railway that's making it easier for people to move, whether it is the electronic funds transfer mechanisms that make it easier for remittances to flow back, whether it is the use of technology to persecute groups politically and through violence. Technology plays this very, very intimate role in the question of migration over time. And one will look, I suppose, will look at the coming 30 years as we tackle climate change and start to see, so the forecasters tell us, very, very large amounts of migration as a consequence of the changes wrought by climate change.
And we should not forget forced migration, as the migration of all the slaves that came from Africa to North America as well. Those people didn't come from their own free will.
No, of course not. I mean, that was millions of people, but I guess that hasn't fortunately happened in the last 200 years or so. So I was thinking more about the last 100 years when I was thinking about that. But of course, yeah, I mean, the whole of the America's continents has that as it part of its, tragic history in all sorts of ways.
Okay, well, now you're growing up in England, and now you are interested in technology. Can you tell us what is it that you study, and how is it that you gravitated to the field of expertise that now is your life?
Well, I was a child of the microchip revolution, in a sense. I was born in the early 1970s, around the time that the first semiconductor silicon chips were moving into the very first personal computers. And so the culture at the time was also seeing a transition in terms of what we talked about from shows that related to cop shows on TV and cowboy shows that the Americans used to produce, through to the start of shows that had technology in them, the science fiction, Star Wars and Star Trek and Battlestar Galactica, and then shows that increasingly had computing. So you had that cultural drive alongside a growth of science fiction where computers were more present, and physically the availability of computers. And I was lucky to get a computer when I was 9. I was lucky that my school, my primary school, the junior school, had a single computer, a Sharp MZ80K, that I was able to get access to. And being curious and, I think perhaps a bit weird, because I hadn't lived in the UK and I didn't know much about the UK, I guess I gravitated towards these machines, and they're technically difficult at the time, and I think I enjoyed the problem. And so I have built my career alongside, if not directly in, this sort of evolution of these types of technologies.
And was that what you study as well?
No, it wasn't at all. So I studied humanities at university, and the story there, I think, is really quite interesting and underpins some of the thinking in the book. So while I did a lot of computing, and at high school, we had a lot of computers, and I was really lucky to be exposed to them and program quite a lot of different things. When it came to going to university at the time, at the end of the 80s, early 90s, computer science was not something that was a subject that my school had experience in sending students to university for. It wasn't something they really approved of, in a sense. And so it didn't even enter into my consideration. I thought about some sciences. I certainly thought about chemistry and broader sciences. In the UK, you specialize quite early on. And I ended up doing the social sciences, in particular a degree called politics, philosophy, and economics, which integrates lots of these different disciplines, but it's quite far away from formal computer science. And it's a real, I think, I don't regret not doing computer science, but there are two marked points there. One is the idea that a school and an education system and the beliefs of the people around you should narrow down your focus against a discipline like that. And the second idea that, and it's certainly the case in the United Kingdom, I think it's less true in the United States, that at the tender age of 18, people throw away all of their science, or if they do the sciences, they throw away all of their social science, the humanities. You don't get to major and minor in most British universities in that way, which I think is problematic.
Okay, was it correct? I think I read on my notes that you either develop or help develop the website for the Guardian newspaper. That for the listeners, I equate the Guardian with the New York Times here in North America.
Yes, I discovered the internet in 1991 timeframe, and I fell into this hole and found it amazing. And I didn't really know what the web was for another year or two, even though I was accidentally using it. And there was very little on the web at the time. There were a few hundred websites. And so when I left university, I was looking for things to do for a job. I couldn't get a job at all. And ended up, after many rejections, helping The Guardian do some work, and I started writing there. And we were very, very lucky that from my little corner of the office, the sort of strange corner where a handful of desks were, we got the go-ahead with zero budget to put together the first editorial website for The Guardian. So The Guardian had done some experiments on the web in 94 and 95, but they hadn't actually put news stories up on the web. And so, yeah, we built that together with a colleague of mine who is now the deputy editor at The Economist. We did everything that you needed to do to put a website up, which was we got the servers, we got an internet connection in, we figured out the domain name system and the routing. If you're wondering about the DNS, this is what took Facebook down for several hours in early October. And, you know, we had only got 3 servers at the time, had to configure those. There were lots of things that you take for granted when you're building a website now that nobody knew about. And we had to do absolutely ourselves. And so, for example, one really common thing that you need to do, you do today is something called load balancing, which is when there's too much traffic, you share the traffic across many, many different individual web servers. That is done completely transparently now. If you're a web publisher, you don't even think about it. You may pay Akamai or Amazon Web Services something to do that for you, and it's a tick box. But back in early 1995, those services didn't exist, and we had to, and not only did they not exist, the common knowledge that you might run out of capacity was not common at that point because most websites were not popular. And so we had to figure out that might be the case, and we had to figure out, in my case, had to figure out how we would deal with spikes in traffic and what the mechanism would be. And you know, with the very limited tools that we had to our disposal, you know, wrote things in device systems to, you know, manage the load balancing in, you know, in 1995. And of course, now it's just trivial. You press a button and it gets done for you.
Wow. Okay, I have so many questions about your book, but before we get there, I also have questions about your newsletter. At what moment in your life you decided, okay, I'm going to write this little newsletter that now has grown to a guide for people who are seeking information about technology?
Well, I did my first online newsletter in 1996. So when I was at The Economist, again, I was putting together the website alongside doing some of the journalism. And I ran a Skunkworks project essentially to start a pair of weekly newsletters. I had approval, but no budget again. So I got someone to lend me some servers, and we used to send this email out every week from a computer under my desk. It used to take us 12 hours to send all the emails out because the internet was so slow, and we were only sending out, you know, 200,000. So I've loved the email format as a format for a really, really long time. I think it's really powerful as a mechanism. It's a bit contained and constrained. And so from that Economist newsletter that I set up in 96, a number of times in the last 20 years or so, I've created newsletters because I find the regularity, I find the fact they arrive in your inbox, I find the fact that we have a connection really appealing. And so in 2015, after I had sold my last company, I was quite bored, but also a bit tired. And I had spent 7 years worrying about the one thing that my company did. And I wanted to do something more broad. And so a safe space for me to go back to was to write a newsletter that allowed me to look at what was happening out in the world without really any direction and describe what I was seeing. And then over time, people seemed to like it. And then it grew. And then it grew to now 65,000 people who get it by email, 140,000 or so who get it through a different distribution mechanism. So it's about 200,000 people who will receive it, you know, on that basis. And it has transformed into something that's more. I mean, one thing about doing this for 6 years is that you end up learning quite a lot about quite a lot of things. And you end up learning from smart people because you talk to people. So it's also helped me improve my knowledge about the world in the near future.
how is newsletters like yours and many other Substack, I think, affecting journalism? I mean, now you have this two dynamic because the winner takes all kind of Facebook, and there is niche, let's say, newsletters or subjects like yours. So it's two extreme, two opposite extremes going on right now.
Yeah, they are, and I think it's going to play out slightly differently. I mean, I don't see myself as a journalist at all. I mean, uh, I'm a practitioner, I'm an active investor, and I advise companies and boards, and I spend no time at all reporting. And I certainly am not interested in spilling the secrets of a company. And then a lot of that relates to the judgment that I have about what's relevant. And that's why founders and investors will talk to me openly, knowing that, the more openly we speak, the more fruitful a conversation we have, and knowing that I'm not trying to find a scoop. I've no interest in scoops. I've interest in realizations. I've interest in realizing, oh, this is the dynamic of an industry that people haven't realized, but it doesn't have to be driven by secret recordings of meetings. So I don't see myself as a journalist. I mean, to the extent that I compete with journalism, it's only because people only have a certain amount of time in their day or their week. That said, I think that newsletters provide a really, really interesting and challenging moment in time. I get absolutely phenomenal newsletters on topics written by practitioners that I simply can't get anywhere else. Wow. And that's very, very helpful. And because they're specialists, I may not even read every one of them, but the ones I do read, I might read one issue out of 7, help me learn in a way that it's very hard to get that quality elsewhere. And then you have the art of journalism, where you understand largely what you're getting, which is, there's a disciplined production process that has its strengths and a few of its weaknesses. And so I, of course, spend a lot of time reading traditional media as well. I think if you're managing a traditional media company, you have to think about a bunch of different aspects. I mean, I think what newsletters do is they construct an appealing alternative to some of your talent, where your talent might say, listen, I don't want to earn, I don't know what you're being paid in by a Canadian paper, right? But X for the Globe, when I can run a Substack. And then I think the Globe has to say, well, look, we will renegotiate your terms and conditions and what you get to do in order to maintain you within our stable. And it's exactly what a record label does to a Jay-Z or a Beyonce, right? They say, well, we won't treat you the way we treat all of our other artists. So for newspaper management, I think it's as much about talent management as it is about anything else. And I really think that the newsletter model is something that is incredibly a huge opportunity for traditional publishers. So if you think about my newsletter and imagine you were a publisher, the amount that you would need to pay me, and then you would then get my audience and be able to do things with my community, and you never otherwise would see those people with the degree of intimacy that I do, would be a trade-off that would be worth making, not just with me, but with 100 other people like me. You could build a traditional publication of it. So it's a complex question and lots of pros and cons on either side, but a really interesting one.
Wow. Okay, so let's get to the topic of your book. Why do you feel the need to write this book? I mean, you already have an audience, people are following you, you get to express your views on a weekly basis. Now you put it in a different format, which is the format of a book.
Yeah, and it's the reason really is about flows versus stocks. My newsletter is a set of flow. And underlining that flow is a thesis that I have started to internalize over the last few years. And there's editorialization every week in the sense of what do I put in and what don't I, and how do I frame what I say. And quite often it's my thinking process. And then if you think about what goes on in the book is a solid, continuous thesis that has an argument and then just enough evidence of different types to evidence the argument that I'm making. And so what's the thing to understand about the book is in a sense, a standalone coherent whole. And if you're reading the newsletter religiously, you'll still see that there's a new thesis in the book. And then you also understand that I've got 80,000 words, almost a whole length of the book in form of cuts. I've about 700 references that never made it into the book. And even then, there are large areas of things that I talk about in my newsletter that don't make it in the book. And yet the book is not less than the newsletter. The book is, it's a precision blade that has been honed to deliver a particular message. And so I think that it's a different entity in that sense.
Wow, great. Okay, so then the book, of course, cover the exponential technology. So what are they and how are they coming about? In fact, the exponential age has been ever since the first human walk on Earth, except that we haven't been able to detect the changes. I mean, we have been detected the changes from 100 years segment to another, but now it seems like it's from one day to the other, the changes that we see in society and technology.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. So exponential change has been with us for a really long time, because that's how we compound things. What I say today is that an exponential improvement in technology is one which improves by at least 10%, probably more, on a compounding basis for decades. And the reason that matters is that we can feel that change during the course of our lives. So even if two cavemen, Julie and Steve, let's call them, a million years ago, improved the wheel at 1% every decade, over their 30-year lives, they would have barely have seen an improvement, yet over 1,000 years, you would have seen a significant improvement. What happens today with a technology that's improving at, say, 14% per annum, is that every 5 years, it gets twice as good for the same price. Or put another way, the price for what you're willing to pay 5 years early halves. And after 10 years, it's a quarter. And after 20 years, it's a 16th. And that's only at a 14% annualized improvement. And if you look at what we're doing in computing, until we moved recently to even more accelerated computers, the long-term trend had been 44% per annum improvement in computing. So that is really phenomenal.
Okay, well, one of the main theses of your book is the exponential gap. So we have in one end of the spectrum Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg, who understand how all this system works. And then I have the local anti-vaxxer in my neighborhood still saying that the earth is flat. So how do we fill this gap in between these two different persons?
Well, the funny thing is, I mean, I do talk about the exponential gap, and you've characterized it beautifully. In some sense, it really is about the types of people and organizations who understand it and those who don't. What I would say, I'm not sure the flat earther is necessarily the person I had in mind as the people who didn't understand this. I think what more is the fact that broad institutional adjustment, so the people who we likely live next door to, the insurance broker and the primary school teacher and the doctor and the builder, and the businesses they work for and the city councils who represent them, those institutions and people don't necessarily understand the underlying processes, nor are they in a position to adapt to them. And the challenge then is not so much about the technology. The challenge is that the exponential gap. It is that adjustment, because the institutions that we have they exist to make our lives easier. But the institutions that we have were defined and built around the assumptions of 20, 50, or even 100 years ago. And so the rules for the road did not adapt to cars really in a modern sense until the 1960s and 1970s, when seatbelt laws really became more prevalent. throughout the world, and they weren't mandatory until the 80s and 90s in the US and the UK, for example. And I don't even think wearing a seatbelt is mandatory in New Hampshire, which is an American state near Canada.
Wow.
So, and that's today. So you end up seeing this simple idea, which is that technologies change the way we live. They create new potentials in the same way that cars create the potentials of squishing pedestrians. And we then need to establish suitable rules so that we can live in a society, a more manageable society. And that's really the argument, the heartland of the argument. And the point being, the technologies move so quickly that you can't really afford to wait 60 years. Otherwise, the technologies get implemented in ways that often will be harmful.
Right. Okay. So can you highlight maybe one of the ways in which, let's take employment, for example, where now corporations, they prefer the gig economy format, while of course employees would rather have, I don't know, set hours, benefits, this and that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great example. What's happening in the labor markets? It's a bit more complicated even than the nuanced picture you paint, because some employees do like the flexibility of being able to work in a kind of gig pattern and choose when they work and choose when they do long days versus choose when they have shorter days. But what we have seen historically as technologies get rolled out is that it's businesses that take advantage of them quicker than individual employees can. And so you then start to see a shift in power towards the business, and that shift in power may be who is gaining from the technology in terms of wages, and it may also be the nature and the quality of your working relationships. So when I look at the exponential age, and what I talk about in the book is the issue for me is not about robots taking jobs and there being no jobs for people. And I'm very clear about why I think that's the case. It's much more that the quality of work may change for many people in ways where that they haven't had the control and the participation in making those decisions. And that quality could be the shift from full-time jobs, constant pay and some certainty in job security, replaced by very, very closely algorithmically managed gig work where you don't really have opportunities for advancement. And that, I think, is the dynamic, the risk in the labor markets in the world of work.
Wow. And also you speak about how cities are becoming more and more important. Cities are becoming like states. And I'm going to share with you what's happening in my city, Montreal. So I live in a French province called Quebec, where the government wants to make sure French is still the predominant language, except that Montreal is a metropolis, a multicultural metropolis, and the city itself prefers to speak English. And so the government cannot control the city. It seems like the city of Montreal is controlling what's happening in the rest of the province. So are cities becoming, in a way, more powerful than the government itself?
I think what's happening is that cities are becoming more important. When we've gone from 50% of the world's population a decade ago living in cities to about 70% now, that trend will continue, and it will continue to continue because there are so many important reasons we need to live in cities. There's much lower resource use. It allows for the development of more sophisticated economies. There is more mixing, more economic specialization. And so you get higher wages as well, even if your costs go up. In addition, many of the technologies of the exponential age enable cities. So for example, solar power and virtual batteries mean that you don't need large power stations burning natural gas to power a city. Vertical urban farms, which combine robotics and precision agriculture and genomics, mean you can make your food, some large parts of your food supply, locally in the city rather than a long supply chain. And there are other technologies down the track that also enable that kind of decentralization. So in that context, what you have is more people living in cities, cities being economically relatively more important especially the bigger ones, the non-city areas, and the cities needing to rely relatively less on national power grids, national food supply, global trading. And in at those moments, there is a political idea of subsidiarity, which is that decisions should be taken as close as possible to the people they affect, or as your listeners in the United States and their forebears would have argued 230 years ago, no taxation without representation. Right. And so in a world where the crucible of creativity is in the cities, where cities end up with sort of the technological capabilities to power and feed themselves, and where incidentally the brunt of climate change will be faced, and it's cities who tend to be at the forefront of policies to tackle that when those policies are within their power, it seems to set us up for a moment of more power heading towards cities in some way. But of course, this is about power. So then it's really up to whether national governments want to federate, whether they want to do that, and what the realities of the politics and the constitutional arrangements are that say, well, cities will get their power or they won't get their power. But those fundamentals, they're going to grow, they're going to get richer, the technologies are going to enable that, I think are here, and they will be ongoing during the exponential age.
Well, my last question is, how can the readers of your book or the listeners of this podcast, how can they thrive in the age of exponential change?
What I try to do in the book, The Exponential Age, is explain what this age looks like. Imagine me like you've come to a big holiday resort with lots of activities and restaurants and swimming pools, and it'll take you the whole of your 2-week holiday to discover all the detail. And I'm the guide who shows you around and says, this is how the lifts work, and this is how the payment works, and this is how you make the most use of the swimming pool and this restaurant and so on. And you take it all in so that you can orient yourself around that resort. And that's what I try to do in the book, is explain the underlying processes in a way that's really consistent, and then use those to describe the exponential gap, and use that gap to explore many of the domains in which we live. And so hopefully you come away with a stronger understanding of what that future will look like, which I think then is the first part of people's own agency in taking control of the shape of the next years. So I'm not going to tell you to go and learn how to code or learn how to negotiate in complex situations or whatever else the skills need to be, because I think that's for individuals in their own contexts to figure out. But I think what my book does is it lays out a sort of a helpful map of what that future might look like, and can be a starting point for your own exploration.
Right. If we are aware of all the changes that are happening in our society, in our political structure, then we can, I guess, make better decisions. I think this is an amazing conversation. I wonder if you could tell us one more time the title of the book, and where can the listeners follow you, sign up for your newsletter, listen to your podcast, all this good stuff.
Of course, the book is called The Exponential Age if you're in America and Canada, and you can get it from the major booksellers, as you would expect. Just Google The Exponential Age, Azeem Azhar, and you'll find it. If you're outside of those two markets, it's just called Exponential, and again, available at all the major bookstores. And if people want to find me, my newsletter is called Exponential View. Again, find it on Google, or find me on Twitter, Azeem @AZEEM.
Thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure, Alain. Thank you so much.